And the topic this evening is Humanly Possible, 700 Years of Humanist Free Thinking, Enquiry and Hope. Sarah is the author of said book, published in March 2023. It is already a New York Times bestseller and a BBC Book of the Week. It explores the lives of humanists from Petrarch in the 1300s to the present day. Her previous books also touch on humanist thinkers which have won the likes of the US National Book Critics Circle Award and the Duff Cooper Prize. She was also among the winners of the 2018 Wyndham Campbell Literature Prizes, and the other books include The Existentialist Cafe and How to Live a Life of Montaigne, and also of interest and a little bit fascinating. Sarah has a postgraduate degree in artificial intelligence from the London City University. So without further ado, and I do know Sarah is somewhere on our screen. Hello, Sarah,
Yep.
and good evening.
Hello, here I am. Hope you can
Thank
all
you.
hear me okay. I think I've got my mute off, so
Perfect.
hopefully it's
how are you?
Very good, thanks. Looking forward to this evening. Thanks very much for inviting me. It's a great
Well, we are certainly excited to have you. I mean, it's my 12th time being part of a humanist talk online, and as I mentioned to you when we spoke over the weekend, we really have had some very informative and interesting and brilliant speakers that have shared their life experiences and their passion for what they do, and clearly the topic you have around your current book will spike interest for many of our guests this evening. So look, I think one of the comments I've actually can come up quite a few times, that how you've managed to get this extremely capacious book into one book versus 7 volumes per se, and all you've covered. It is astounding, and I'm sure we're all going to be intrigued as to how you were able to wrestle with the concept and the genesis of its being in formulating such a manuscript. So perhaps you might enlighten us as to how you began to look at your brilliant book.
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, on the sheer length of it, I mean, at one point, I think it could have been somewhere around the kind of 1,000-page mark or more, but I cut it down quite a bit, and really I wanted it to be not some sort of great comprehensive tome, because I think writing comprehensively about such a huge swathe of time and the history of humanism would be absolutely impossible. So it was much better to just write my own take on it, to follow my own very meandering path through the things that interested me. And in terms of selecting what stayed in and what went out, my principle was to kind of keep in the, I hope, interesting stuff, keep in the stuff that intrigued me or the fun stuff, and kind of throw out the boring stuff, because there was a lot of trying to sort of make connections between things, which of course is important to do, but I wanted to really focus on the personalities and the stories of these people's lives and how their lives connected to their ideas, because I think that's so much more interesting to read about. And we're human beings, we're kind of hardwired to connect with other human beings, is one of the humanist principles that I started with. So yeah,
and where did the idea really kind of where did it come from? Because you've obviously looked at humanism in quite detail and depth, and how did you formulate the seed that was planted to say?
My own starting point was that I realized that almost everything I'd written about, certainly in the last couple of books, was held together by different kinds of humanist ideas. The existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre described himself as a humanist. existentialism is a humanism. He said, although then he changed his mind when he became a bit more of a Marxist. Montaigne in the 16th century was very much a humanist in several senses of the word. And I wanted to explore those connections and figure out what they had in common. But of course, it was also driven by the fact that I realized that I had really been a humanist all my life, although, like a lot of people, I think it takes a while to figure out whether that label is applicable. I think there's this funny thing that humanists have a natural tendency not to want to fix labels onto people, but instead to think about individuals, or to, approach the world in a more subtle way. So there's kind of, to call yourself a humanist is almost not a very humanist thing to do, because it's putting a label on yourself. But, I think a lot of people realize suddenly that the way they see the world kind of matches up to what humanists stand for. And it can take a long while to just encounter the idea of humanism and to realize what it is. And that was certainly the case with me. So I also wanted to explore the personal side of it as well. So those things all came together into thinking, yeah, I really want to write a book exploring all of these connections.
And there was a novel, sort of, I guess, look at somebody maybe not as well known in humanist circles, and the author and cartoonist David Knox. So you talk about his book, Second from Last in the Sack Race, and the topic, or the discussion piece amongst a small group of like a class of children around what is humanism.
Yeah, I kind of borrow or steal, I suppose is one word for it, but with credit, his idea of this scene in which, and it's my starting point in the book. So the scene is that a group of high school students decide to set up a humanist society. And of course, at the first meeting, the first thing they have to talk about is, what is humanism anyway? And it comes out that they all have completely different ideas of what humanism is. And the things that they mention are the main strands of humanism. So, one person talks about the definition that you quoted at the beginning of this evening, which is very much that of humanist organizations today, I think, which is good without God, having a moral life without the underpinning of religious institutions. Another person says, but no, it's a philosophical principle of human dignity and, sort of human well-being. Somebody else says, well, no, isn't it all about the Renaissance and their attempt to escape from the Middle Ages and, sort of all the scholarship of the Renaissance? And somebody else says, oh, I thought it was like just being nice and looking after old people and bandaging sick animals and things. And somebody else says, oh, we're just wasting time here. To which that person, the other person says, are you calling looking after old people and bandaging sick animals a waste of time? And so it's comic, he was a great comic novelist, and the whole thing falls apart in a certain amount of disorder. But my starting point was, well, actually, they're all right. All of those answers are perfectly good answers to what humanism is, and it illustrates the richness of the word and the concept of humanism. So let's take that as a positive thing rather than a negative thing or just a source of chaos. Let's look at all these connections, look at each of those meanings and see what they have in common. And really the idea that I came to was that they do all have something very important in common, which is right there in the word human. So the humanities, which is what the Renaissance stuff was all about, the dawn of modern humanities study. It's called the humanities because it's the human studies. It's the study of human culture and society and literature. It's putting human moral life at the center of things rather than divine commandments and so on. So kind of all the meanings of humanism are really united by that idea of the human realm. So that was my guiding principle, from which I then, as I say, I really went on to look at as many of the interesting figures as I could from all these different forms.
Because you said in their own way, all of them are properly equally valid in the sense that those people's views of their definition of humanism are perfectly fine when they look at it from the different core
Well, it's all
realms you
part of
talk about.
the richness of the term humanism. I was very keen not to ever get into this kind of, well, mine is the real humanism and yours is fake humanism. It's like not really humanism. I mean, I think that's absolutely unproductive and just not very humanist, I suppose. So yeah, they're all different. They're all extremely different, and there's different historical reasons why the term humanism got applied to each of those fields of activity. But I do think that they have important things in common. So yeah,
those young school children were on the pulse of the logical pathway of, or maybe unlogical or whatever. But you move it through to looking or delving into the three classic divisions or realms as you see them around humanism, or the facets of it. Could you maybe explain that a little bit to us then?
The three, do you mean like the sort of
So the
three
divine
definitions?
and the physical, the
Oh,
human.
yeah, that's right. I mean, this is the
Touch on,
idea, I
because
think,
that's
of,
kind of the
yeah, exactly, of the human realm, which I think unites all of these. So there's this classical, long-lasting idea that of the fields of study or the fields of life or of existence, there's the divine, which is, the transcendental realm, dealt with by religion, studied by theologians. And there's the realm of just like the physical world, which is, studied by scientists, studied by physics. But there's also a human realm, which is that of culture, language, art, but also morality, society, and politics. All of these things, and
humanity.
much more. And really, all of these are things that are very strongly human things that we do. I mean, it's not to say that there's no sign of similar activities in other animals. It's not an exclusive thing exactly, but it is a very, very distinctively human realm of activity because, language, art, symbolism, moral principles, all of those things are so central to human life. It's very much part of it's a massively important part of every human life in whatever culture and whatever period of history we're in. So there is this idea that the human studies, so when the idea of the humanities comes from the human studies, and the reason they're called the human studies is because they're the study of those things, those human things, not the study of theology, not the study of physics, but the study of the human. And I think that's that's a really powerful idea to start the ball rolling with, because it's taking that realm seriously. I mean, on a cosmic level, it may or may not be of much significance, but to us as human beings, all of that activity and all of that human way of seeing the world is of course absolutely colossally important and interesting to us.
And do you see that those three are connected, from the theologian side to the science and the human side? Do you see how they mash and mix in together?
Well,
From the
they
work
do,
you've done?
yes, that's right. And of course, you get a lot of overlap historically, leaping way ahead from all of that classical idea to the 19th century. You start to get a great merging of ideas from science and ideas about the human. And so, of course, you've got Darwin, and you've got all the dialogue and debate that went on around the implications for how we see ourselves. So
With
the fact that
Humboldt and Matthew
we're
Arnold
evolved, we're
and
clearly the
Mills.
results of evolution. Yes, we're physical beings, but we're the products of a developmental process as well. This was something that goes very contrary to what the Christian and Jewish biblical story of creation says. So it, you know, you see a great meeting really of the kind of humanism which was concerned with debating the validity of religious stories about ourselves with the kind of realm of science. So you do, certainly there are points that brings together all three of those realms in a way. I certainly don't see them as being separate, but I think that it's a very interesting distinction because it does remind us that that human realm doesn't have to be, where I think it's very relevant is that sometimes you get people who attack humanist or non-religious ways of thinking by saying, well, it's not like we're just slabs of meat, we've got souls, we've got spirits, as if there's only two things that you have to choose between. There's either a kind of very religious view of the world, and view of our souls as having a theological underpinning, or that somehow we're just saying that we're just mechanisms, or we're just things, we're just animals, even.
And you
And I
reference a
think
lot.
that the human realm,
Yeah.
it's a reminder that it doesn't have to be an either or thing. I mean, there's this huge realm in between, which is moral and social and human,
And
which doesn't have to be either
you
one.
you referenced then, the playwright, Rome playwright Terence, and the quote,
Mm.
which I found, amusing, but on point is, "I am human. Nothing human is alien to me."
Yeah.
And then from that, moving through to Petrarch and the 1300s. So that, if you could maybe kind of bring us to how you're able to understand that they, even at that point, were looking at humanism, or the concept of it, as we moved out of different dark periods into light.
Okay. I mean, I think there's a whole load of things to unpack there because, so I'll come back to Terence. Remind me if I forget, because that's actually great. That the story of that quote is quite interesting. That's from, of course, the Roman world, the 1300s, and Petrarch, Boccaccio, and various other writers who were working at that time. They came up with this idea of there being a dark age from which they're emerging into the light. Most modern historians are very keen not to see it really that way. It's not a kind of like the Dark Ages were benighted, terrible, no study, no intellectual life, no human sort of independence from religious institutions or anything like that. There's certainly, it wasn't a straightforward, suddenly people emerging into the light, like in, I don't know, Close Encounters of the Third Kind or something. But what's interesting is that that's how some of these people saw themselves. So Petrarch was a absolutely prime example of a 14th century man, living in Italy, Italian by origin, although he was actually born in Avignon in the south of France for complex historical reasons. But he was very much bound up with the various cities on the Italian peninsula where he lived and worked. He wrote a huge range of kinds of literature, from grandiose poetry to beautiful love sonnets to letters and works of advice and political works.
I know Eric Banks said he felt that that was the beginning of writing, which you would dispute to a degree.
Well, I mean, there's certainly, I don't think you could possibly say that. There were so many people writing before him and in other cultures. But what Petrarch, what makes him really interesting, he's interesting for various reasons to do with, his work. He went around digging out manuscripts in monasteries that seem to be forgotten of the classical authors and copying them and distributing them. So great, rediscovery of knowledge. But one of the things that makes him interesting is that he saw himself as in a very dark century, because it really, I mean, dark in the sense of a really bad century to live in that part of the world, because there was the plague most famously catastrophic, but also lots of wars and general insecurity and famines and terrible suffering. He lost many friends to the plague, and to wars and, you know, sort of general mishaps. And so in a very, very difficult time, he felt that a kind of revival was needed, and that the way to find a new start was to go back to the writings of classical Rome, especially, ideally Greece, but he couldn't actually read Greek. Very few people in Western Europe could at that time. But so he kind of defined this idea of a new start. And when we talk about the Renaissance, which literally means rebirth, although he didn't use that term exactly, but that's what he was seeing himself as doing, was providing the material for a rebirth. So of the human studies, humanities, literature, study of politics. So it made a kind of good starting point for me, because he was setting out the terms of what became the humanists for several centuries, did the kinds of things that he did. So I did say I'd come back to Terence. There's this wonderful line has been quoted by so many humanists over the centuries. You know, I am human. I consider nothing human alien to me. It's beautiful because it implies that we're all connected by an essential humanity. And this is an idea that you find in various cultures around the world. It's a very strong humanist tradition, I think, that is saying that we're morally and socially bound to each other in a very deep way. We recognize ourselves in each other. We can understand each other to some extent. It's fantastic. But the funny thing is that he, who was basically a comic playwright, put that line in as a joke. So it occurs because one character pops up and accuses another character of being a busybody who's always nosing into his neighbor's business. And so that guy says, I'm human. Nothing human is alien to me. It's kind of like, what can I do? You know, of course I'm interested in other people's business. So it's really a joke, and it would have got a laugh, I think, from the audience. But it also turns out to be quite profound, almost despite itself. And I like to think that Terence would have, you know, had a sense of this profound meaning too, because his experience, he'd been born into enslavement. He was always called Africanus, so he was from northern Africa, probably, sort of around where Carthage was at the time. And he, as a boy, he was a slave to a Roman senator, I think, certainly a Roman man of some distinction, who eventually freed him, partly as a reward for writing such entertaining plays. But he knew what it was to be not to have his full humanity recognized by another, I think, by living in enslavement. So yeah, it's quite a nice story. It kind of falls outside my 700 years that I imposed on myself with the book, but there were a few things in terms of background, because it crops up again and again. So many people wrote about it. You know, it was one of the lines that the 16th century French writer Montaigne, who I'm so particularly fond of, having written a book about him, he had that line written on a roof beam right above his head in the study where he worked. It inspired him so much.
It really traveled the ages.
It did, yeah. And I think it's still, you know, I mean, it's still something that to reflect on, even though, as we know, it actually was a bit of a joke when it started.
So if we, you know, move towards the 19th century, and you talk about how there's maybe, I suppose, a sense of hopefulness emerging with people like Mills and Humboldt around, I suppose, just greater equality and greater opportunities for children, education, and university structures, and how you feel that, you know, was moving towards, again, humanism for the wider public out there.
Yes, one of the things that, and I'm not sure it's such a great story of progress, but a little bit. I mean, one of the things that is very conspicuous with the early humanists is that, on the whole, they were male Europeans, often of a privileged class. A lot of the early humanists were very much an elite. They were they had a big humanist education, that is, in the classics, because they were destined to become either princes or politicians. And so it moved from being something for a very small elite and just assumed to be something that mostly women were excluded from, with a few exceptions, but mostly.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, as time went on, there began to be voices that piped up saying, but actually, if you're going to talk about human studies and humanity, surely that shouldn't be confined to such a small group. So one of the characters who does figure in the book, along with a few other women that are in the story, although sadly they're a bit few and far between in the early stages. But by the 18th century, Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote Vindication of the Rights of Woman, great feminist, as is very well known, but I think also she was very much a humanist, in the sense that she really believed in human flourishing, like that people should be able to fulfill themselves and really grow into moral adults, was a term that she used, whereas women tended to be, especially of the upper classes, actually tended to be treated as children all their lives. I mean, they had no legal rights. They didn't really ever, it's not like they ever attained the years of majority, because they could never own property. They didn't have full independence, and they were treated like, sort of idiots, really, treated like children, and were sort of brought up to behave like children to a large extent, she felt, to be, sort of petty and self-indulgent, and all these things which she felt education, a good, really humanistic education, that is in something that's character building, something that exposes you to the much larger fields of human experience, is essential to becoming a human being with all the potential that brings. This was all very much an Enlightenment way of thinking about human beings. It was a part of a kind of historical moment when people were very interested in the individual and freedom and being, a fully realized human being, not being oppressed. And so this was all part of the talk of the day, but she, with one or two others, applied that to the situation of women. So she was an example of people who started expanding this strangely limited idea of what a human being was supposed to look like, and what it meant to be a kind of fully developed human being. And of course, we've seen many other, obviously there were, another figure who features in the book is Frederick Douglass, who was very well known in America for his narrative of his life. He was born into enslavement, and sort of with, like, deprived of all education and treated with a total lack of that basic recognition of humanity that we were talking about. Nothing human is alien, but he was sort of treated as excluded from that, of course. And he wrote about how he had gradually, it was like a kind of awareness that that this wasn't right, that this wasn't set in stone, that it didn't have to be that way, partly through encountering books about the kind of the classical arts of good speaking and oratory and good writing and eloquence, all of which he perfected. I mean, he taught himself to read, got himself sort of an education, eventually escaped to the north and became a great abolitionist, and a great speaker, very, very eloquent speaker on the subject of abolishing slavery. So again, you know, all these are all part of the story, but you know, I don't really see it as if there was all this kind of darkness and then suddenly in the 18th or 19th century let there be light. You know, I think it's been a much more complicated story than that. And you know, yeah, the struggle continues after all, you know, there's no denying that.
I know, and I like the way you've talked about the challenge of having the optimistic view, and the pessimists and the optimists, and looking at hope and responsibility, for the advancements of life. And we had a tiny chat about um AI earlier, and over the weekend, but there's always this constant battle or arm wrestle around the advancements we have achieved, but then what do they bring, and what suffering, or what do they cause? When there are those that continuously try and seek to be optimistic and hopeful of a better today, tomorrow, and we know as we sit here, the world is in turmoil around lots of different things, and so maybe if you could maybe just for now leave us with looking at that part of our nature on the abdication or the holding on to hope, optimism in
Yeah,
where
it's
we are.
so it's something that humanists have struggled with, and not only humanists, I mean human beings have struggled, particularly in the story that I tell. It comes into very sharp focus in the 20th century with all the appalling atrocities and wars, human rights abuses. You know, I mean, I don't need to sort of remind everybody just how much that threw into question our idea of ourselves as being. There was this sort of 19th century idea in Europe of us as being essentially quite good and reasonable and rational. And this very much threw all that into question and proved very difficult for humanists to figure out a response to. So some fell into despair, and some tried various ways of preserving a kind of hope in ourselves. I think that the arguments that I find most convincing are certainly not anything that's like, oh yeah, everything's fine, we are basically quite nice. I don't find that as convincing as the people who said, look, the problem is that if we do completely lose hope in ourselves, then that just makes things into even more of a self-fulfilling prophecy, that we can't possibly expect to develop the more constructive faculties that we have, or to get ourselves out of any of these messes, unless we do put some kind of trust in those better qualities to develop them, to take responsibility for them. I think the idea of responsibility is key, really. I mean, to despair of ourselves completely is also a kind of abdication of responsibility, because it's saying that we're just hopeless cases. I mean, there's nothing that we can do is going to stop the miseries from continuing and the abuses from continuing. And there are moments when I feel that way. I think we probably all do. I mean, or many of us do. But that is also a way of just throwing up our hands and saying, well, there's nothing to be done about it. Whereas clearly we might not be able to make all the problems go away, but there are ways of just trying to use our better faculties. And I think the two key things that do offer, they're things that we should try and do more with, which we are reasonably good at if we just sort of acknowledge the fact. One is that we are able to use reason to some extent. I mean, we are able to reason our way through situations and also predict what's coming. I mean, look at the way that we know what's going on with climate change. It's not like we don't know about it. We know about it because of our science, because of our ability to reason about things. Let's use that reason to find solutions. And the other thing is that we are reasonably good at cooperating with each other. It's this, shared humanity thing again. We're potentially better at that than we might think, because obviously we're struck by the way that we constantly kill each other and don't manage to cooperate. But again, it's really the world of science is something that I find quite interesting, because the international scientific community do manage to collaborate extraordinarily well and to get things done. So why can't we do that in politics? I mean, I don't have the answer to that question. We do seem not to be able to do that, but it proves that we could do it. We can do it.
Very valid point.
So yeah, I mean, that again, I don't have any. I'm not in the business of giving answers and being any kind of guru in these matters whatsoever, because I'm struggling as much as everybody else. I do think that it's interesting looking at the history of humanism, looking at some of these humanist thinkers who did wrestle with the same difficulties, especially in the 20th century. It's interesting to look at what they said, and especially what they said about hope and responsibility. And it can be inspiring, it can be helpful.
You had a nice quote from James Baldwin in the book about, one is responsible for life. There's that small beacon from, darkness where we come from and where we will return, and one must negotiate this passing as safe and as possible as we can for those coming after. So, we all have this responsibility where best we can to leave behind something of, of good and hope.
Yes, that's right. And I love that quote. It's one that I more or less end the book with. I mean, it's almost it's not quite the last thing, but it's in the end of the book, I kind of come back to that quote, because I think it's beautiful. Yeah. And it is inspiring.
Yeah, it really, really is. Now, I am conscious of our time clock, and I always, I'm sure that people would, at this point, if you're okay with it, I can see we have 40 participants. So, again, welcome and hello everybody, and thank you for joining. If I can ask at this point, and I believe Sarah, you're okay with some questions. And,
absolutely,
so,
yes.
As always, if people are happy to ask a question, if you can raise your hand function on your screen, and we will say hi. So, hello, good evening, David. Please kindly unmute yourself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Sarah, this has been a truly wonderfully warm review of a subject which you know more than any of us about. And I think all of us will have felt a deep sense of gratitude to you for raising such lovely stories gently along the way. If I may say so, in a humanist way, you've done it so gently, and teasing out things which I think we've all, I think most of us have been struggling with all our lives. So I'm going to just make one little suggestion for you in your reading. I have How to Live a Life of Montaigne beside me here, and your relatively new book on the history of humanism that's on my bucket list. But books are so important to me, and I think to many of us. I'm going to mention two books which you may know. And if you don't, however, I would thoroughly recommend them, because I think I'm sure they'll interest you, and I'm also sure that I think that they'll help you. So if we consider your three realms of essentially divinity, and then you said science, and then you said, of course, the human. And in science, you relied a little bit on physics, and people tend to do that. But I'm a geneticist, and I would appeal to you I think you may well have been this way. You were only saying a few words, but biology and the role of genetics and the role of, say, the study of evolution, these lead to huge insights which are different from the insights you get from physics. And you are very much aware of the old argument about determinism, is there free will and all that. Does the human realm, as emerging through evolution and biology, is it different from the physical realm? And one of my colleagues in Trinity has written an absolutely wonderful book, only just published, Princeton University Press, and I hope you will read it. It's entitled How Evolution Gave Us Free Will. Here we are. How Evolution Gave Us Free Will.
Who's the author?
Kevin Mitchell. Kevin Mitchell. And he focuses on agency and the idea, the question, do we have free agency? Are we capable of being independent agents? And he comes down heavily on the side of, yes, we do. Yes, we have free will, and it is something that has evolved. So it's a really, really beautiful book, and
sure.
I actually think it may turn out to be a very important book. The other book, which you may be familiar with, and I'm sure you're familiar with him as an author, E.O. Wilson.
Oh, yes. Yeah. No.
And he has a most beautiful book entitled The Social Conquest of the World.
I haven't read that one, but yeah, I've read a few of his others.
His fundamental idea, which is not proven, of course, but is easily, I think, accepted sort of intuitively, is that we are social animals. We are truly social animals. And he would have argued, he's dead now, unfortunately, that we're social because we're genetically wired to be social and cooperative. So you mentioned at the end there the importance of cooperation. This comes, he would say, and Kevin Mitchell would say, other evolutionary biologists, I think, would say, is part of us. And we should have enormous confidence in it. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah. Thanks very much. Thanks very much for the book recommendations, especially, both of which are new to me, although I do admire E.O. Wilson's other books. Just on the subject of physics and the human realm, I was talking in the context of the classical world's ideas. So it's physics in the sense of Aristotle, physics and metaphysics. So there's physics and what comes after physics. In a very loose sense, physics. I was really speaking, and I think that what's interesting about what you say is that now, it's those boundaries have become much harder to draw. But there was this idea that, there was the realm of the gods, the realm of matter, and the realm of, and then it's social and moral and cultural life, I suppose we would say, which is a kind of, it's an intangible realm, but it is not a divine one. It's not a supernatural one. It's one that takes place in human representative, so like the way that language represents the world or art represents the world.
Oh, yes.
It was something that the art historian Erwin Panofsky wrote a lot about, was this idea of the symbolic realm. So it's everything that represents something, which is something that we humans quite distinctively do with our art and language. So that's the kind of the tripartite thing. I certainly didn't mean to kind of reduce everything to physics or to imply that. And I think that what's interesting, exactly as you say, is that we're much more aware now of how whatever we do in the cultural and social realm is, of course, deeply intertwined with our animal being as well. It's not they're not mutually exclusive. And I think even Darwin, I mean, he didn't know about genetics, but he did speculate in The Descent of Man. He did speculate quite a lot on the possible origins of morality and religion in our social animalhood. So yeah, but thank you very much for that. That was really interesting. Thanks.
Thank you, David. Okay, do we have anybody else would like to ask a question? If so, please kindly raise your hand. Owen, good evening. We don't see you, but
On
we
mute,
can.
yes. Good evening, Mike. Good evening, Sarah.
Hi, Owen.
I can't
Hi.
see I can't see myself. I see a smaller screen, but I don't need to see myself.
No problem. We can hear you loud and clear.
Congrats, Sarah, for that. In your book, Sarah, you describe yourself as a non-believing humanist. And sorry, this isn't a question, it's a simple statement, if I just may pass it on to you. As a non-believing humanist, which says something about yourself, I think. It avoids the atheist label that some people find a bit off-putting, on the one hand. And on the other, it's sort of a pointer to secular humanists that, as your book tells us, there have been many believer humanists. So you bring us to an awareness of that we don't have an exclusive on the term humanism. And I just find those two, the balance in those two, heartwarming. Well done. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, I'm just sort of trying to remember the context where I said used the word non-believing humanist, I suppose, but that certainly would have been it. I think that excuse me, that it was you know, I'm not a believer in anything divine or supernatural, you know, and so in that sense, well, I mean, I am an atheist. But I do see those as two different things. I see atheism and humanism as often, of course, working together. I mean, atheists and humanists, I should say, because I always like to talk about people rather than isms. A lot of overlap, a lot of working together in modern humanism, but I think that the emphasis is different, as is summed up by the definition of humanism that we heard at the beginning from Michael. I think the emphasis is on moral and social and cultural connection to one another, and not so much on the sort of denying something. I mean, atheism is a negative word. It's atheism. It's you know, it's the denial of theism. And of course, yeah, it's a lot of humanists through history, by writing such a wide scope of definitions of humanism and across such a long period of time, it's very apparent to me that, you know, there's no way that a lot of the people that I'm writing about were doubters of the existence of God in any way at all, really. I mean, they all came to different balances of it. I think what they all shared in common was that they were really, whatever they believed about that, they were all really much more interested in human life here on earth and our relationships with each other than they were in anything theological. So that to me is a really key fact. It's a really key shared thing, and more important in a way, I think, than what they actually may or may not have believed about the other realm and or, you know, the afterlife and whatnot. So yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, thanks for raising that.
Thank you, Owen. Very nice observation. And, you know, I think, like Sarah, you know, to that point about, you know, humanism being a simple philosophy and ethical life stance, and, you know, looking at human values and being good without God. And maybe, you know, there's a danger in even, you know, looking at that side of, you know, life and faith, because as you said before, that there are many people that have faith that are also humanists in their own right, and you know, whatever their you know, focus religiously, and that, you know, people, you know, can be humanist even if they are, you know, devoted towards a particular type of, you know, religious belief. And so yeah, it's certainly good to see the other side of it. Thank you for that, Owen. Dominic, good evening, and welcome, and your question, please, or comment. Thank you.
Hi, can you hear me, guys?
Yeah.
Yep.
Hi, Sarah. Sarah, I wonder, do you have any insight? It just occurred to me as you were talking there. It's always kind of slightly puzzled me, and I've never really explored it. In history, when we became evolved as humans and started to think and started to, you know, walk and feed and give ourselves shelter, and why did it occur to humans to invent this fanciful other supernatural being that was going to determine how we lived, when it's so much simpler and so much more sense to be humanist?
Well, who knows? That's a big question, and I would, as I mentioned earlier, for example, Darwin himself speculated about what the origins of religious belief were, and the origins of moral judgments and opinions as well. You know, I don't have any expertise in evolutionary psychology or anything like that. I think that I rather suspect that it goes back very deeply into our past. I mean, the religious notions or belief in supernatural beings of some sort it seems to be shared by most human cultures and communities, and I think there's every reason to think that it would have arisen kind of quite early on in thinking about things. I mean, ironically, I think it's partly the human tendency, which probably developed early on, to speculate and wonder about causes of things that probably led to those beliefs. So in a funny way, it has a lot in common with scientific inquiry, because again, it's like asking about why and how things happen. So I do think it, is probably is very, very deeply rooted in our past.
The ascribing possibly of misfortune to things than us, and you know, I guess when we're all kids, if we're good, nice things happen. If we're bad, you know, and if we're not good, not nice things happen. Funnily enough, I always, if I'm ever in conversation with someone, I never say the phrase "I don't believe in God." I say the phrase "I don't believe in a God," because there are 3,000 of them. You know.
Oh, at least, yeah.
You know, it's I only believe, as Ricky Gervais says, you know, if you're talking to a committed, believer, you can just say, look, you don't believe in, 2,999. I only believe in one less, you know.
That's very good. Yeah.
It's anyway, there you go. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
For a fantastic
thank you. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dominic, as always, appreciate it. Pat, good evening. You can lower your hand. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to double check, Michael. Are you saying that being a theist and a humanist are not mutually exclusive?
Was that a question for Michael?
It was a question, Sarah.
Sure,
I beg your pardon. For Michael,
go ahead.
yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just picking up on a comment he made earlier. And
no,
I'm just seeking clarification on it.
No, I was just looking at the general world viewpoint, Pat. So it wasn't a statement as such.
Okay, so I'll put the question to Sarah then. Is it possible to be a theist and a humanist?
Well, first of all, I'm very much a writer of a historical frame of mind. You know, I'm writing about figures from the past, and it's absolutely, to me, there's no question that while they all were humanists in various ways, all people that I write about in the book, that the vast majority of them kind of were theists, as I say, only in the sense that they, you know, whatever they may have believed, and I think they would have all differed a lot in emphasis and degree of belief, but I mean, it was so woven into the society that many of them lived in. And to me, the distinctive thing that so many of them share is this much greater interest in the earthly life of human beings in the here and now. To me, the sort of the most pointed example of that is Montaigne, again, you know, quoting my old favorite there, but he wrote through all the huge, like 1,000 pages odd of his essays, he you know, never denied any of the religious creeds. In fact, he always said that he was a good Catholic and he accepted the right of the Catholic Church to tell him what to believe, which which is such a blunt statement that you sort of almost wonder if he was taking the mickey. But I think it's you know, fair enough. That's probably is kind of how he felt, but that every page shows how much he wasn't interested in the stories of Christianity. He wasn't interested in resurrection or prospects of the afterlife, or he just doesn't write about those things. He doesn't pay much attention to them. He writes constantly about human life and character and what it feels like to be a human being, and about literature, the literature of the past, the collection of books that he had absolutely absorbed himself in, the people that he'd met, the reflections that he'd made on his experiences, politics, you know, the state of the world around him. And to me, you know, that is the really interesting thing. That is what makes him a humanist par excellence, is that he was so focused on that. What he did or didn't believe in terms of theism is kind of, to me, it almost doesn't matter hugely by comparison with that focus on human life. So yeah, if that goes some way to answering your question, yeah, that is really how I see it.
Could I just add something to that, Sarah, please? And that is that if humanists are there to understand what it means to be human, would that be a fair comment to make?
I don't even know that is true, because can we really fully understand it? I mean, I don't think that we're going to arrive at any definitive understanding even of ourselves anytime soon. I mean, part of what it is to be human is to ask questions and not to be quite sure what it means to be human, I think, in the end. So I'm not, I think actually the cover blurb on the book did say something about all trying to understand what it means to be human, but that was that was produced by the publishers rather than by me, because I think that yeah, trying to understand what it means to be human, yes, I think that is very much a human activity, and a humanist one. But succeeding in understanding what it is to be human, I doubt that, you know, that's actually achievable. So yeah.
Yes, I think that's a fair comment. But in the effort to understand what it means to be human, is that we know humans who believe in another world or believe in the notion of God, you know. Surely as humanists, can we not make an effort to understand what is the purpose of that for them?
Yeah,
Do you know what I mean? In that very
I do. No,
compassionate way.
Well, I absolutely do. And also, you know, I mean, I am someone who you know, loves religious art, for example. Yes. You know, and so much of the art that I love and music is religious in its inspiration and its context. And you know, religious belief has inspired people to do wonderful things. Also, you know, morally and socially. I mean, I think there's plenty of admirable things in religion. Religion, I think, it's hard to sort of think of humanism as being somehow opposed in some drastic way to religion, when religion is such a human activity. I mean, as we've said several times, you know, having religious beliefs or having religious feelings seems to be very much a part of what it is to be human. And so therefore, you know, it would be very kind of strangely unhumanist, I think, to sort of deny that or not to see anything good in it. What I am very opposed to, what I really don't like, is authoritarianism in religious institutions, telling people what to think, imposing punishments on those who are heretical and disagree. And I dislike that, whether it comes from religion or whether it comes from secular governments. I dislike that kind of authoritarianism in any form, and I see it as deeply unhumanist and anti-humanist. So yeah, I think I find it useful to distinguish between those two things. Thanks.
I agree with everything you're saying there. I just have a nervousness that humanists I've met seem to be hostile in their attitude towards those who do exercise a belief in God. I don't think that's good for us as humanists to be hostile.
Yeah, I mean, it's, it happens. And again, I suppose it touches on the this strange borderland between atheism, including militant atheism, and humanism. So yeah, it's a complex relationship.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks.
Thank you, Pat. Appreciate your input. And I did see a Claire, I believe, had her hand up. Claire, if you're still there, you're welcome to say hi.
Hi, yes, hi. I must say, Sarah, it's been lovely to hear you speak. I haven't read your book yet, so I shall read that soon. But I just wanted to say that religion, has always been sort of involved in people's lives. And as you say, more in terms of dogma, really, and telling people how to live. So it's always been a social thing. And I think, particularly with our history here in Ireland, it's been problematic, to be, to live freely. And so I suspect that's why humanists maybe have become more hostile towards the church. But I do agree that it's important actually to be more open and to respect people's beliefs and not throw everything out, so I just wanted to say that.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Claire.
Yeah. Thanks.
Very, very nice comment. Anybody else? And then just to be fair, we've gone over time. Sarah, are you okay if we go on for a little
sure.
bit more?
Yeah, a little bit more.
If there's dinner or if there's dinner waiting, or or a late supper.
Actually, it's I'm an hour ahead because I'm in Italy at the moment, so it's a little bit later than
yeah. Well, I'm conscious of that,
but I'm very happy. I'm very happy to go on for a short amount more. And I see there's another raised hand, I think, has appeared on the screen. So
thank you for that. Bridget, good evening.
So, resulting from this discussion, is our organisation misnamed? Should we refer to ourselves as secular humanists? The Secular Humanist Association of Ireland. If humanism is such a broad church, is it us who are out of order?
I certainly don't think so at all, because, then what about the humanists who teach the humanities? Because that's another main, very important meaning of humanism today. In America, particularly, people who teach the humanities in universities or study them, more so in American usage, but they refer to themselves as humanists even today. So, and nobody's sort of saying that they should change their name to like literary humanists or something. I mean, I'm sure everybody has their own view, but I mean, I have no problem with a whole range of different forms of humanism, all just calling themselves humanist. I mean, it's I'm very, I'm not very keen on sort of drawing boundaries between things. I'm much more keen on finding the common areas and just exploring them. I mean, for me, it's really just been a way to see what these different meanings of humanism can have in common, and why that would be interesting, and why there's a lot of communication between them. So yes, I'm not really I certainly don't feel that there's anybody's wrong.
Yeah. And I was recently asked a question by a 9-year-old, what is humanism? And I'm afraid I burbled somewhat, and I've thought about it, a lot since. But my own feeling and why I joined the Humanist Association of Ireland was because I find the concept, especially the Abrahamic God, I find that notion wholly offensive. I mean, you spoke just a few moments ago about the good that many religious people and religious organizations have done. And you're absolutely right. Some of the most decent people I have ever met would be of a religious persuasion. On the other hand, there's an awful lot of them who have done an awful lot of utterly appalling things.
Oh, yes, I'm very aware. Yeah, absolutely.
And and also I'd be one of the humanist celebrants, and it's very important to me that, well, I mean, for a start, we're only allowed to do legal marriages because we are secularists. And there's an awful lot of confusion there. And I'm wondering if the HAI as an organization is adding to it. It's certainly confusing me at the moment.
Well, I mean, it is, you know, I mean, of course, this question, what is humanism, is one that has been with me throughout the writing of this book. And the more I think about it, the more I'm aware of how many different things humanism can mean to different people. So, yeah, it is difficult. It's always difficult to explain or to explore or to, come up with a sort of coherent definition. Yeah, to me, that's part of the appeal of it. That's part of what makes it so interesting to think about. But yeah, sure, yeah. Go ahead, Michael. Yeah.
No, just like I think it was the piece I liked about the humanities, the science, the humanitarianism, and that combines the different layers. So certainly, Bridget, food for thought on the definition. But I think that's going to be a conversation that will be there for since the beginning and the middle and wherever we'll get to in the end. But thank you for your comment. And I think one thing I liked about you also are very conscious, Sarah, of Humanism International, and how associations around the world that are linked to humanism are seeking to promote it. There are countries that, like here in Ireland, may be more open, acceptable to humanism, and then there are those that aren't, and sometimes that can be quite difficult for people in countries. So we as an organization, we seek to plug into making sure anybody that sees themselves as humanist can do so without being threatened in any way.
Yeah, I think that's a really important part of what international humanist organizations around the world, and of course Humanist International itself, are doing, because there are countries in the world where you can be killed for being a humanist, for calling yourself a humanist, for identifying yourself with humanism. And it's vital to provide the support, provide the consciousness raising, the awareness, the integration with the international community, all of which I think is, it's fantastically important that humanist organizations are doing that. Yeah. Thanks for bringing that up. Yeah.
No, I think it's a valid point, because we do look at it. I know our CEO is on this evening, and a lot of work done around our connectivity to everybody else to ensure those that seek to be simply humanist are allowed to do so, like anybody else that have any other focus. I am conscious we're now at almost 9:15 in Ireland, 10:15 in beautiful Italy, where you are. And look, I think we've certainly listened to lots of wonderful ideas. The book is fantastic, and we'll be putting up a summary of this evening, and your permission as always to have our talk on our YouTube channel.
Yes, that's
if I may, I'm going to ask for Sarah to give us her final word, as we always do. So over to you, Sarah.
Well, mainly to say thank you very much for inviting me. It's been a real pleasure, and it's great to meet you and to have had this chat. And you know, good luck with everything that you're doing. And yeah, it's great to have been a part of it this evening.
Thank you.
David, would like to leave a final word? I see you're still there.
Oh, no, I have to, no, well, really, it's been a splendid evening, Sarah. And if I could put it this way, I really hope that this is the first of quite a number of interactions between you and humanists in Ireland. We've so much to learn from the history and the way you have painted it, which I'm so much looking forward to reading. I'd like in particular to thank Owen Morton, who is listening, I think, and Owen has he was absolutely insistent. David, you have to read How to Live a Life of Montaigne. So we are plugged into you, Sarah,
Wonderful,
and
thank you.
we hope we'll hear you again. Thank you very, very much.
I hope that too. Thank you.
So thank you again, Sarah, on behalf of everybody. And it's been a wonderful event and evening. And as David said, and all that are on, and we certainly would like to keep the connect. So hopefully that's in person, where you're always welcome to our shores. And so
that would be great.
Really
I would
thank
love
you for your time. And to everybody else, good night. Or as they say in Italy, buonasera.
Good night.
Buonasera.
Good evening.